Gonna start it. There we go. Okay.
No, lost Ari.
No.
To talk about all manners of diversity. What happened? Is she okay, we're good. All right, diversity. And guys, please forgive us. We've been having, it's one of those technology days, so just, yeah, bear with us. Show must go on. So today we're going to talk about, to start with Ayana.
Yeah.
If you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, my name is Ayana Gray. I live here in sunny Florida, and I like to write pretty much young adult fantasy. I especially like writing stories about Black girl magic. That's me.
And are you there?
Am I
You go next.
Wait, is it me?
Coco.
Okay, hi. Hello
Please
everyone. Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Coco Ma. I am a young adult fantasy author, and my book Shadow Frost is releasing this October. That's my debut, and it's very exciting. Anyway, so I'm really excited to be on this chat and speaking with all of you guys, and yeah, just discussing awesome things. So yay. Okay, I'm done.
I'll go since Ari's still muted, I guess. I'm Raquel Miotto, and I write young adult fantasy with Brazilian folklore. My book has a lot of African mythology too. Yeah, that's me.
Well, welcome, all of you. Let's just jump into the questions here, because I'm afraid the technology gods may come after. We're going to be talking about diversity, and the first question that we have seen all across Twitter, and that we've been with diversity in literature growing up. Do you feel accurately represented? And there, it's like one question lumped into, it's like five into one. So your experience with diversity in literature growing up. And we'll on the order.
Sorry, I didn't get any of that. You completely froze up, so I don't know where.
Oh my God. Okay, so the first question is, what, it might help if I pull this down. All right, so the first question is, what diversity in literature growing up? And let me look at the second part of that question. Did you feel accurately represented? What were some struggles you encountered, like things that you wanted to nurture or you wished was there? And so it's just kind of 5 questions lumped into one.
So who's answering first? Is that me? Do a yay or nay? I can't really hear you. Okay. I go. So see, as far as I remember growing up in Brazil, it was American literature. It was Harry Potter that I grew up reading, and no, there's nothing at all, about Brazil in it whatsoever. But I was just in love with it to the point that that's part of what drove me to learn English. Was I wanted to read the last Harry Potter book, and it wasn't out in Brazil yet. So I bought it in English, and I have. It's the first copy of the last book that came out, and I'm like, I am going to learn because I want to know what happens in the end. And I remember it was some funky romance, and it was all American literature. I remember reading one Brazilian book, and one, it was an adult about vampire books, but that was it. And no, there was nothing about Brazil in either of the Brazilian books. So yeah, no, I never felt represented at all growing up.
The Coco.
Oh, it's me. Okay. Well, I think for me, I think I was lucky to grow up pretty sheltered in a sense. I think actually hilariously, I thought that um, someone told me that Asians were a minority, and I was so confused because um, when I was in elementary school and middle school, you know, the majority of the kids in my class were actually Chinese. So I assumed that the Asian community was like a really strong, and you know, it was like a majority. So I think when I was reading books, it wasn't so much of an issue for me, but I remember picking up Marie Lu's first book, like Legend, and I remember reading her name on the front of it and thinking like, huh, that name sounds weirdly Asian. And then for some reason I was like really surprised to find out that she was actually Chinese. And for me, I guess that was sort of an awakening of sorts, um, to like just realizing that, you know, a lot of the authors and the characters of the books that I was reading were not, you know, representing me of any like in any sort of way. So yeah, that was kind of the eye-opening moment for me. But yeah, she's an amazing writer, obviously. So that was really, really cool.
Yeah, I'll just throw my 2 cents in as well. So for me, I my tastes in books have remained largely the same since I was a kid. I have always loved fantasy. I love the magic. I love getting lost in these made up worlds. So that's it's pretty exclusively what I read as a kid, and I definitely did not see representation, positive representation, definitely in fantasy, whether it's adult or young adult. There were sometimes a few Black characters. They were always sidekicks or like a magical guide, but there were never any stories that I could find where there was a Black main character, and a Black person portrayed in a positive way. And it definitely shaped my understanding of literature and my understanding of being a writer, because I figured that there are no Black people because they're not supposed to be here. This is not a genre for Black people. So definitely impacted me, and that didn't change until fairly recently, like into my 20s. So.
I'm just the host. But I haven't, I just wanted to add, growing up, seeing that much diversity in literature either, no matter who it was coming from. Started with Harry Potter, and that was probably the most amount of diversity that I had. And but I can definitely see a little bit of a change now in literature, and it used to be people I probably could have read from were just white straight people, and now they're just voices that weren't represented before. So it's really cool to see how span, which is not that long. So you know, it's the next question is, so this is more about you experiences as a marginalized writer impacted slight underrepresented characters. And we can begin with Raquel. You go.
I can't hear anything of what you're saying. So I know what the questions are, and I can somewhat hear what you're saying. So let's not ever start with me, so I can know when you tell it to start. So yes, whoever's supposed to start, go.
Coco.
Oh, am I going
Coco.
now? You keep cutting out for me as well, but I'm just like going off of I mean, I think like this question especially made me take a moment to sort of assess like what does it even mean to be a marginalized writer? Because I think in terms of ethnicity, like would it mean that someone would pick to read the book, like a book written by a white author, as opposed to a book written by, me, for example, a Chinese author, just because of, what I look like or what my ethnicity is. I think, like, in terms of gender, that's been a really big thing for me. So, I mean, I want to see powerful female, like really independent female characters um, in like taking the lead in stories, and that's one of the things I really focused on in my writing for Shadow Frost. Um, for Shadow Frost specifically, in terms of race, like the world isn't our world. There are 9 kingdoms, and I really try to not match up with, the continents that we have, the countries that we have. But in terms of underrepresentation in the context of the world that I was writing in, I like to think that, I wrote the characters with the same amount of care and thought and development, regardless of what they looked like. And that whatever victories or, tragedies that they faced were as a result of their own actions and, their own personalities and choices and that sort of thing. And, not because of their appearance, because yeah, I guess like even in our current society, it would just be so nice if people, accepted you and, treated you for like who you are rather than just like what you look like, I guess. So yeah, something like that.
I could jump in. I never want to speak over someone. Um, I Yeah, I think Coco brings up a good point. There's a difference between being a marginalized creator ethnically or because of your sexual orientation or something else to do with your identity, and then writing a story about marginalized people, especially when those people are not part of a culture that's yours or they resemble a real life culture that's not yours. Those are two different things for sure. I think for me, in a way, it's interesting because in some ways I am marginalized, and in other ways I'm not. So because I'm an African American woman, and that's visible when you see me, that's a type of marginalization. But on the other hand, I am engaged to a man. I am getting married to a man. I'm a cisgender woman. So that part of me is not marginalized. And I think it's important to be aware of the parts of your life where you are and are not marginalized. And that impacted my writing like throughout my childhood and into adulthood, because I felt like there was only one type of person that could be the hero or heroine in a story, and they typically did not look like me. So
Yeah, it's the same for me, and it's not, that question is kind of loaded. Like, how do you write an underrepresented character, a marginalized character? Like, what is the difference? Why does it have to be different? What is the difference between writing a marginalized character and writing a white character? So it's a funny, interesting question, because it's kind of like say, like, how do you portray yourself when you walk out of your house? Is it differently because I'm Brazilian and I was born and raised in Brazil, opposed to, hey, I'm a white American, I can. So I don't really understand the concept, but as far as it does affect, I would assume, I suppose, world building and stuff like that. So as far as that goes, my world building starts in 1600s Brazil, and it is time of slavery. That's who I am. That's who Brazilians are. That's where we came from. So it starts in the real world, and then it goes into this fantasy godlike world of the Orishas. So I think that's as far as this question goes, I think that's my answer. It doesn't really impact how you write your characters, your marginalized characters, but what's around them, perhaps.
Okay, I think. Oh, do we? Oh,
Everybody, I'm
hi,
here. I'm
you're back.
good. Keep going. Keep
Okay,
going.
okay.
Sorry. Keep going.
I think we're going on to the next question. All right.
We are.
So
I just for that question real quick. It was more of So I think someone mentioned that there were so many calls for underrepresented character as a writer coming into this, like how you deal with that, that call for. And I do agree that it does feel like, well, how, I'm writing kind of from, my point of view, my stem. It does seem like the question is loaded, but it's kind of an, I'm not sure coming from, but from, get rid of that over there. It was more of a just coming into a publishing industry where that's the big, everyone's calling for more diverse voices, how you as a writer is kind of navigating that in terms of finding, your voice being heard in the writing community. I guess it could have been worded like that, but all right, next question. Let's see. So in terms of diversity and inclusion, what does this look like in literature? We kind of answered this with the first one, but this is more like from, like, so I guess we'll just ask the question, what does diversity and inclusion look like in literature for you, for everybody really? Like what would, in a perfect world, what would it look like?
I think I'm going first. So,
answer.
I think like it's
Ayana?
not only
Coco?
am I going? Okay, I'm just gonna go. So,
Can
personally,
anyone hear me?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Can you see us? Okay.
Go. Okay,
go.
keep
I'm
going.
going. Okay. So, in Shadowfrost, there are a lot of characters that come from different kingdoms. They come from okay. They come from different economic
Can
backgrounds.
anyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
I
We
give
can
up.
hear you. Okay. And I think like they come from different circumstances. They grow up differently. They're in different.
Can anyone hear me? You can hear me fine?
From different
Okay. So in terms of what I just asked, the question was, how would you define diversity and inclusion, and what does this look like in literature overall? So anyone who wants to answer can go ahead and answer.
I'm gonna keep going. So
Raquel.
I mean, their families aren't necessarily perfect. They're definitely not perfect. There are different siblings. Some parents may or may not be there anymore. And the biggest thing I think is that some of the characters are magically very, very powerful, and some are pretty weak. So, but either way, they face consequences and responsibilities. So I think diversity is like having the variety, but inclusion is more accepting all of those people for who they are and the choices they make. So, and giving them room to grow and supporting one another throughout whatever journey they're going through as a character. So, I mean, like, obviously, if you're like a rude dipstick or like a tool or something, no one's gonna like you. But I mean, if your personality reflects someone who I think has a lot of respect. I think respect is just so important for the other characters and the situations they go through. I think in that case, inclusion is just, you know, that's just like, it's just about respect, inclusion, all of that stuff. So yeah, like everyone has room to grow, and even if that amount differs, I guess, I think it's really about just supporting that growth amongst the characters across the board. So, oh, you're muted. Wait,
You're muted.
am I muted?
Ayana.
Wait, no, I'm muted.
Ayana's muted.
I muted
Okay.
myself. I accidentally muted. I muted myself while I
Okay.
was talking.
All right. Okay.
You made me think of something just now when you were talking about diversity versus inclusion. I think when you have people think, sometimes I see it anyway, where people are like, oh, look, I've got diversity. I've got an Asian character. I've got a Black character. Check. Like it's a list.
Yeah, no, yeah,
And
for sure.
I think the difference between diversity and inclusion, to me, diversity is having a presence and inclusion is having power. It's one thing to have a side character or like a random character that gets killed off on chapter 1, diverse. It's another thing to have a character who is a lead in the story and who affects the story as a whole. Like,
for sure.
Y'all, I love Lee Bardugo. You know, her main character in like Six of Crows is a disabled character. She, in fact, you know, her entire cast and they're main players. They're not these characters off in the margins. So I think that's really important, and I want to see more of that in lit in general, especially YA lit.
Yes, I totally agree with that. So, yes.
Right, they're great points, and I'm completely on board with everything you guys said, and especially my story. So my main character is an Afro-Brazilian, so she's not a Black character. She's half Black, half Brazilian, which is, well, she's half white, European, Portuguese. So I call the Portuguese are the bad guys in my story, and I call them the white man, because it's always been, you know, the slaves against the white man who came over to Brazil to colonize Brazil. But it turns out the white men are actually even white, because Portuguese aren't white, the blonde, blue-eyed stereotype of white. So even though I talk about them, the white men are bad, they're actually not even white. So I do actually add that in the story. But when you read it, you say his light brown skin, and everybody's like, whoa, I thought he was white. But that was the concept of white then, you know. And I feel like I'm a horrible person to talk about this subject, because I'm still trying to understand myself, what's right and what's wrong, and what people think it's right and what people think it's wrong. So I told Ari, and I'm like, I'm probably the worst person, because I have more questions than answers when it comes to diversity, marginalized writers, and what it even means, you know. So I'm just gonna sit here and not.
That's part of the journey, though. I think, you know, it is an identity, a journey as you write, figuring out who you are. So that's part of it. That's good.
All right, are we going to move on to the next question? You're muted.
I just told her to.
Okay, on to our next question, which will be so what would you consider so if someone wanted to write more diversely, or want to become more aware of how to do so without offending or frustrating or the do's and don'ts. What would be the do's and don'ts of writing diversely, in your opinion? Because there are some people out there, some writers who do, and or try to, and so this would be kind of a good place to fill them in on how you feel about them writing diversely, and just some do's and don'ts that you feel will be helpful.
So for me, it's like, please, 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 please just do your research. Like, please, the internet is a great, well, internet can be bad place, but internet has great things. Like, so, I mean, I think especially if you're writing about a culture, um, whether or not you are even part of that, even a part of that culture, it is so important to do your research. Like, it doesn't matter if you're writing fiction. Like, don't go pulling things out of a hat and just, think you can wave it off and say, it's a fictional world. Like, I can make whatever I want up. That's not true at all. And I think going back to what I was saying earlier, it's like it's really a lot about, respect and being sensitive and open to just like other opinions and what is fact, and like a boo. And I guess a big don't would be it pertains to like physical descriptions. So I've seen a lot of examples where people will refer to either a character's skin color or a physical trait, like the shape of their eyes or something like that, or hair, and then like just throw in a simile to some kind of food. So like, for example, that like her eyes were shaped like almonds. I see that all the time
Yeah.
For Chinese characters, right? And Asian characters. So I mean, it's one thing to fall to like a cliche and a stereotype, and if you like, I shouldn't say fall, but if there's a purpose to it, if there's like a subtextual meaning, or if there's a secondary meaning, and just being like lazy and just, oh, I heard someone say that. And I mean, it's just like there's so many different shapes of eyes, like you can't, I like it, that makes me nuts, like pun not intended. But just, yeah, I think you, if it were me, I would actually advise someone who is describing a character to even imagine them as like your significant other. So when you describe them, even if like no matter how flawed they are, you want to describe them in a way that really, I guess, highlights in, a really caring fashion, like their physical traits. So yeah, I would just, there's a lot of information. Like when I started writing, actually, I did a lot of research on, how to describe, you know, eyes, or how to describe hair. Yeah, so one of the first things you'll find out is like, don't go and say, someone's hair is like chocolate or something, or their skin is like chocolate, or, you know, just, like, just please put in a lot of careful thought, be unique and authentic, and do your research. That's all I'm gonna say. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. I get asked, I don't know about you guys, I get asked about this a lot. And I think that I have a lot of well-meaning friends who are like, oh, you're a writer of color. But I think that's a little bit, it's dangerous. It's not, it is a lot of it. It's dangerous to think, oh, I've got a writer friend who's of color. They're going to be the authority and know how to tell me how to write.
Yeah.
I am one person who has had one experience. I cannot tell you how to write about Black people. So I think that's number one. Don't assume that because you've got one friend or one contact from the culture you're writing about that you're done. You're not. I think a do is, like you said, absolutely do your research, do your due diligence. I think you do absolutely, you should definitely think about, I always think about anyway, a YA reader from that community how they would feel reading my story. Would they feel sad? Would they be embarrassed? Would they be offended? Try to envision how you would feel reading about your culture written by somebody who's from outside of it. I would say absolutely don't fetishize people. Don't try to exoticize. I see that a lot. People are like, oh, I'll set this in Asia because Asia's cool, and they get stuff wrong. But they're doing it because they're trying to be exotic and trendy because diversity is trendy right now. Don't do that. And also don't get defensive if and when you choose to write about a culture that's not yours and somebody corrects you. You have to be ready to receive that. Recently, there was an author who wrote outside of their culture, and when people from that culture came to that author with questions, they became very defensive, and it just wasn't a good look. Because I mean, I think those are the people you're writing the story for. Hopefully you should be ready to receive them, so don't get defensive. Those are my do's and my don'ts.
Right, and I think while there's definitely more don'ts out there than do's, I do know that I have, it's even weird to say that, white friends that want to help write marginalized characters. So and they've asked me, hey, how do I do it? How do I do it without, you know? And I think I recently read Crown of Feathers by Nikki Paul Preto, and which I think she did a magnificent job because she didn't go into detail. She didn't try to describe. She just said his brown skin or his tan skin, or she didn't go in the shape of eyes, just dark eyes, light eyes, and it was very broad, and it was at the same time very eclectic. Everybody had a different shade, so you could tell that what she was wanting to do, and it came across the right way to me as I read it. I didn't read brown skin and was all defensive, but why is she running? No, because personally I would, even if it's side characters, and I know that's mostly frowned upon, but if, like, technically Hermione was a side character, wasn't she? However, she was brilliant, right? So if she had been a different skin color, of course it would have made it all better for all of us of color, so we would have seen Hermione was Brazilian, Hermione was black, it would have made it so much better. And so, yes, I don't think there's anything wrong with writing side characters, and especially if you're a white person try to write a side character of color. I automatically, that makes me feel good about it. It makes me feel not just like, oh, they're just trying because diversity is popular. No, I'm like, maybe they genuinely care and they want to help out, and they want, I don't know. That's, like I said, I have more questions than answers, but I like to see that. I like to see people try to have a best friend who's not white, or a daughter or a mom or an adopted whatever. I like to see that. So that's my answer to my friends that said, hey, I'm not a person of color, but I want to write, I want to help propagate that knowledge and that way that things should be done. And that would be my answer. Go for it, try it. If it doesn't work, like Ayana said, do listen to the feedback, send it out to beta readers of that culture that you're trying to write, see what their thoughts are. And if you get something back that's not what you intended, either work on it, remove it. But I would say go ahead and write those side characters, because honestly, they're just as important to the story as the main character. We all know that. So.
Yeah, I think I actually have a couple things to add on. I mean, one of the things is in terms of just, respecting, and the thing with beta readers as well. If you ever feel like you have the slightest doubt that something might come off as insensitive to your readers, just put in the work. Don't be lazy. Figure out what it is and just fix it, because like I think the things that we write, especially in this generation where we have such a wide reach, every word counts and every character counts, and you're putting up an image, and we have the responsibility as writers who connect with so many people to put up an image that supports every person. And also, I think that's one of the really great things about writing. It's in terms of like physical characteristics and that kind of thing, in comparison to film and TV, is that it's sometimes it can be so vague. I think actually someone brought up the point that J.K. Rowling never even really specifically said like what Hermione looked like, say for
Right.
the bushy hair, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
a lot of people, like I actually had a friend who assumed that Harry Potter like had an American accent just because he was like raised and his father read it to him with an American accent. So then, when he watched the movie and found out that everyone was English, he was like, well, what the heck? And he hated it. So I like using that as, an example. That's one of the really great things about writing and reading, is that, it's really all up to your interpretation within, as much as the writer wants it to be. And yeah, so yes. Should we go to the next question?
I don't know. Is Ari really there, or she's kind of just there? She's muted right now, so if she's talking, we can't hear her. There we go.
Okay.
I'm pulling up the next question.
Right.
Okay. So I think we already kind of covered question 6 of the what are things writers should be mindful, informed / aware of, especially if they do not come from a group that's considered marginalized, but writing a character that is marginalized. So if you have anything else to add on that, you can. Or
Actually,
I'll
yeah,
move on to the last
I have
question in
one
this
more thing to
segment.
say. Like, remember ticking boxes was mentioned earlier, and I think that's like a really good point, because there's a huge difference between, inserting a diverse character into, your writing or your story, and just for the purpose of them being diverse. I mean, for me, like, in a way, going back to Harry Potter, because Harry Potter is like everything. Um, for me, Cho Chang was not someone that I looked up to at all. I mean, obviously she was intelligent and brave and an amazing
Okay, the
Ravenclaw.
next question is, are there any events, like writing events, resources that you would recommend to others who are just other writers, and what advice would you give authors facing any similar obstacles that you may have faced on your journey of writing? So it's like a two-pointer. The first is, what events, resources, books, etc. that you have found inspiring, beneficial, empowering on your writing journey, and what advice would you give other writers?
So I'm gonna
and whoever
finish.
wants to speak.
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead and finish, because that was amazing. Sorry.
I'm gonna finish what I was saying before, and then I'm gonna move on to the next one. But as I was saying, but there were like a ton of other awesome Ravenclaws, and I didn't feel like Cho Chang was someone that I wanted to look up
Did you guys
to.
not hear that?
Can someone text her? Anyway, but on the other hand, I just watched the Fantastic Beasts movies recently. I mean, like, I watched them when they came out, but I just watched the sequel, and like, seeing Nagini on the screen being so freaking epic, I just, for me, that was like it.
The next question is, are there any writing resources, events, anything like that you would recommend to other writers to empower them, encourage them, that you've found beneficial, and what advice would you give to those, writers who are just starting out?
Okay, so anyway, to finish up, just just really quickly, write characters who you want people to look up to. That's all I'm gonna move on now. Like I said earlier, the internet can be a great resource. Um, Obviously, there are lots of trolls on the internet. So be mindful, and there are a lot of opinions that, you know, that are not necessarily right or wrong, or, you know, black and white in any kind of way. So, and also, of course, lots of bias. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who, with the purpose of wanting to be heard, who go on there. And, you know, I think, especially as writers, we have the responsibility to listen to those people, and not just on the internet, of course. By the internet, I also mean people who read our books and go and review them and comment on them. And yeah, so I think, and another thing is just having role models yourself, other authors you look up to who do an amazing job. Like for me personally, like as someone who's just written, you know, their first book when they were, like, I was 15 when I wrote Shadow Frost, and I'm still not, like, I'm basically just a legal adult right now. For me, I know that I have so much more to learn. I know that my view of the world is, you know, just scratching the surface of, you know, what's really there. So for me, it's just like totally just a constant learning journey. And I try to be as open and as mindful as possible, just to respect other people's opinions, but also not just be swayed by, you know, a general consensus necessarily. To just, you know, take time to think and formulate my own voice, and hopefully that will shine through in my writing progressively. So yeah, as time goes on and that kind of
And
thing.
that brings me to a question, of course, more questions than answers. For example, let's say, Coco, you're my best friend. We've been best friends growing up my whole life, and you introduced me to your culture, and I think it's just beautiful. And I want to honor you and your culture by writing something about it. You know, is it right for me to do that? Is it not? Yeah, and that's how and why I struggle when people ask me,
Yeah,
you know,
sure.
how do I write your culture or your story, or why can't I do that if it's something that I think it's so beautiful and I want, you know, why can't people write that? And that's what I'm, as a writer of color, struggling with. No, I haven't written anything very outside of my scope yet, you know, and I don't think I intend to. But and even Ari is like, well, Ari loves Japanese culture, you know, why couldn't she write about it? And I think she is so intelligent and well versed and educated, and what I've read of what she's written is amazing. And so that's one of the questions that I have, and I see people getting, you know, backlash because of that when they didn't even necessarily do it wrong. And I think that's why a lot of people are struggling with right now. And me as an author of color, I'm struggling with it, you know. But yeah, no, I got no answer for that. So how would I do that though, you know?
Do you want to take that one, or I can add in, or?
Yeah, sure. Like, I mean, yeah, you can go first if you want. I can add in later. No
Oh, well, it is tricky, Raquel. Like it's hard. And like I said, I think this goes back to intent and purpose. If you have studied and you have decided that your story borrows from a mythology that belongs to a certain country, and this is where the culture is based, I think it is possible to write a story outside of your culture, out of your lane, whatever. I think it's not really like, am I allowed to? One thing to think about, unfortunately, about traditional publishing anyway, is that it's very possible that when someone tells a story of a certain culture, the way that unfortunately a lot of people treat it as, they're like, oh, cool, that's our Chinese fantasy for the year. And then what that does is it makes it next to impossible for the Chinese American or Chinese author to come through with their fantasy that come, you know, and people say they get doors closed on them because it's like, we've already got our story. Sorry, that's not right. That's tokenism and it's wrong, but it's what happens. And that's why you get people who get really upset and really hurt because they feel like someone got to take their narrative and their life, make a story out of it, and now they don't have a chance. And that's not anyone's fault except for, I think, the publishers who do this, who close the door to people of color or people who are from the LGBT community or people who are disabled. That's a high level problem. But I think it can be done with intent. And I also think you should ask why am I telling this story? Am I doing it to honor a culture because I've done the research and I really want to celebrate this beautiful culture? Or am I doing it because I think it's trendy and this agent that I really like just said they want non-Western fantasy, so I'm going to write a story to cater that? That's wrong.
Right.
So it's all about...
No, absolutely, I agree, and that's what I'm saying. If somebody came over, and if an American wrote a story about Brazil, and let's say it's even close to the story that I've written, and they get it to be a major deal, and I'm sitting here with my little book, and of course I'm going to be like, wait, why? You know, so I get both sides, and that's why I have no answers. I'm like, Ari, I'm not a good person to be in that chat right now because I see both sides, and yet what is there to be done about, you know, what can we do about it? What can publishers do about it? Because you're a publisher, you get this book that's really good, and you're like, oh, well, I am not going to buy it because it's a Brazilian story that wasn't written by a Brazilian, you know? And so I just see all the sides of this big, huge puzzle, and yet I have no idea how to put it together.
One thing I think that can be done is, again, these are the top dogs who have to change the mentality. We have to get rid of tokenism. So the African continent, for example, even one country in Africa has so many ethnicities and so many cultures within it. I have a friend of mine who is writing a story based in East African folklore. I have friends who've written about West African folklore. Those are two different stories. So we have to educate and teach and share this idea that we don't want to have a one and done mentality when we write. We should be able to take in stories from different areas of the same continent and appreciate them as two different stories. You should be able to write a story about Afro-Brazilian culture in one dynamic, and then later that year, there should still be room for another Afro-Brazilian story. We need to get rid of that one and done mentality. I think that's how we do it.
Right.
Yeah, I think especially for me, I've been seeing so many Chinese authors, you know, pouring out books, like especially this year. And I think like it's so empowering, you know, to think that, you know, I mean, all of my friends were, you know, because of the school I went to where the majority of kids were Asian or Chinese, like a lot of the friends that I grew up with who loved reading were Chinese, and like to have all of these role models to be able to look up to, I think is just like so great. And I think that needs to be something that happens for, you know, all types of people, not just, you know, here. And I think in that way the community is like sort of, it's like progressing. I think we're making progress, but I think like a lot more needs to be done as well.
Ari just asked a question here in the chat. She said, do you guys think that misinformation and ignorance by writers and publishers, so ignorance of culture, contributes to these issues? I think yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's like, and that's where stereotype comes into, you know, the writing. And it's, for example, people assume that Brazilians love spicy food, you know, when we really don't. And so I go out to eat with my friends and I'm like, do not even black pepper, do not put anything spicy on my food. And they're like, what? You're from Brazil and you don't like spicy? So if that happens on a daily basis with my close friends and people that, you know, it's so easy to do in writing. So it's so easy for people to stereotype, and it's like the almond shaped eyes. And so, yes, misinformation, it's a big part of it. And even in my story, I had a feedback from somebody from one of the Twitter competitions where she came back and she was like, something about favelas, which are, it's the ghetto in Brazil, which didn't come into play until like later, way later in history. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, not once in my manuscript did I mention favela. It wasn't even a thing. It's not, you know. So this mentor for this competition stereotyped in a feedback to me, the author, trying to educate me in my history of my country that I was born and raised in. So that was very difficult for me to accept. So I can understand how a writer, if I'm reading, I see a book about Brazil, I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to read, and there's all this misinformation. Oh, I'm going to be livid. You know, so yes, absolutely. I think misinformation is definitely a huge problem. And it all goes back to do your research if you're writing something that's not your own.
And that's why it's super dangerous, or people get really up in arms when people from outside of their culture write, because, you know, for sometimes, you know, somebody who doesn't know anything about Chinese culture, who doesn't know anything about Afro-Brazilian culture, they pick up a book and that's their exposure. They're going to educate themselves off of a book. And
Right.
It's cool if that's accurate, but if it's not, you've just miseducated somebody, and you've just miseducated someone about a community that's not yours, and they're going to internalize these ideas that are wrong. So that's why you see a lot of people get really defensive about it. I can't stand that.
No, yeah, I think it's a lot about how much effort you want to put into being a good human being and being respectful. Because I mean, whether or not, you know, like if I were to write, you know, a Chinese young adult fantasy, you know, taking from Chinese folklore and that kind of thing, I would have so much research to do. Like, I'm pretty sure that I know less about that kind of stuff than, you know, the next person, which is on one hand unfortunate for me because, you know, I really wish, you know, I put more effort into that kind of thing, and I'm sure I will. But there is no excuse on the other hand. Like, even if you are, like, no matter who you are, still do your research. Like, that's at the end of the day, I think for me, that's the most important thing. And also, I think you should always be sensitive to, you know, who your readers are, but also if you are a reader, who the author is, because, you know, I think a lot of the time people assume that they might know something, and that might not necessarily be right. Especially if, you know, the author, like, you know, was mentioned, that is your culture, or, you know, you know this because it's a part of you. And then, you know, a reader who might not be so well versed or well educated is not sensitive to the fact that, like, to that fact. I mean, for me, it hasn't really happened so much in terms of, you know, culture or race, because the characters in Shadow Frost, like, they're the countries don't our countries don't exist, but they are young. And I feel like a lot of the feedback that I've been getting, which, you know, I appreciate every single piece of feedback that I've gotten. I don't care how bad it is, or how, you know, just like offhand it is. I value every single piece of feedback, and every single comment that I've gotten. I think about all of them, and a lot of them tend to centralize around the fact that the characters um, act in like a juvenile or young, immature fashion, and I think that's a totally valid opinion. At the same time, I had one person actually say to me, well, not personally, of course, but they did mention that they were like a substitute teacher at a school, and that they felt that some of the dialogue reflected like what their students in middle school were saying. And so that kind of got me thinking, right? Because as a young person, I felt like some of the dialogue that was being said, and aspects of the romantic relationships between the characters, were reflections of my own experiences and things that my friends and I have like even said to each other and somehow made their way into my writing. So it was I feel like that sort of is a much less extent of the confusion and a little bit of anxiety that a writer might feel. Like I felt like a little bit attacked on one hand, but at the same time, like I said, every single piece of feedback that I get, I really take into consideration, and I greatly appreciate, like, no matter what it's saying. So yeah.
You're muted, Ayana. Did Ari send any more questions?
I've just said we're ready to wrap up, so she's going to ask. I think.
All right, I had to unmute myself. All right, so that's it for today, guys, on our discussion on diversity. It was actually a really great discussion. I couldn't really hear some of it, but I'm going to go back and watch it today. Thank you, Ayana, Coco, Raquel, so much for coming in and talking about this today, because it is so important to discuss, especially with the writing community. And yeah, so we're going to put all of your guys' links down below so people can find you and follow you, stalk you, talk to you. And yeah, guys, thanks, everyone. We're going to get going.